Yeah. Are we going to see more and better Australian content on our TVs, streaming services, and in our cinema? Yes, says the Australian screen sector, which is billions more dollars will be pumped into the industry, and the flow-on effects for both the quality and the quantity of Australian stories will increase. It's a win not just for the people who work in the industry and viewers like us, but also for Australia's profile in the increasingly competitive international screen market. Claire Pullen is the Executive Director of the Australian Writers Guild. Hello, Claire.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you along. Also with us is Matthew Diener, CEO of the Screen Producers of Australia, and we'll get to him in a moment. Claire, for people who are not in the industry, can you tell us what happened this week? Because it was also quite a close-run thing.
The result till it came through. Nonetheless, it is a great win for Australian stories. One of the things that it was proposed, there were quite a few things actually that were proposed that we would be losing in this bill. So this was a reduction in the amount of local content that Foxtel is required to produce. It was proposed to cut the offset for Australian feature films. We were going to see an increase in some of the thresholds that would essentially double the costs of some films. And also we were going to lose what's called the Gallipoli clause, which is where you can claim an offset for when you make part of an Australian film overseas, like you would film part of a story about Gallipoli in Gallipoli. And so right up until when the bill went through and the amendments, we're really happy as a group of writers of where we've landed, which is there's actually been an increase in the offset that you get for producing TV shows in Australia. All the offsets have been harmonised at 30%, which is going to stimulate investment and production of TV shows and feature films in Australia. We're so happy to see that. Our industry needs to jump straight back into all the projects that got cancelled or paused because of COVID, and this is a great place to start doing that.
Uh-huh. So, I mean, I don't want to get too far into the weeds on the politics of this, but what happened in Parliament?
Oh, look, on this one, genuinely from our perspective, there was really good faith engagement from all the MPs, and we had a lot of really long conversations going back quite a while, sort of into last year, about what these changes would mean. So we were able to explain to MPs, for example, things like what this would do to Australian children content, for example. And I hope I'm not alone, but when the kids come home from school and they say math instead of maths to me to describe learning, that is really jarring for me.
Yep.
And I want my kids to get educational content that's in an Australian accent and tells an Australian story. So we were engaging with MPs around what all of this means and how the regulation needs to change into the future to make sure that that's being delivered in Australia, and worked really closely with.
Okay, so there was amendments sort of forced into this, which is what saw it go through. So as the Australian Writers Guild, you look after the people who try to get scripts up. Tell us what you guys do and who you cover.
Sure. So the Guild looks after screenwriters, both for TV and feature film. We look after game narrative designers, so that's the people that write the stories that are told in your video games. And we also look after playwrights who put on productions on all the stages around Australia. So we cover everyone who does that kind of work all over the country.
Mm-hmm. And how has the pandemic affected the industry? I mean, I've heard that in a way Australia's reputation as a place you can go to have a great production experience if you're an outside company. But what's COVID meant?
Look, it's affected different parts of our membership really differently. Playwrights have obviously been devastated. They haven't been able to put a work on a theatre stage for 2 years. And even now when they're reopening, most venues have capacity limits which at best halve the number of people that can go. Up until COVID began, so our screenwriters were doing reasonably well. There were some changes to content quotas brought in the beginning of this year that were really troubling, but things were going, productions were closed down. Border closures meant we couldn't go overseas to film our stories and people couldn't come here to film with us. Of course, for our game narrative designers, their industry's seen a bit of a boom, but that's still a nascent industry. It's the beginning of their growth, and it's certainly nowhere near as established as our screenwriting and playwriting. It's a bit of a mixed bag for our members, but like everyone, COVID has had an impact on their work, and we're really looking at what we need to do into the future to make sure that there are still Australian stories being told and Australian voices on our screens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Claire Pullen is with us, Executive Director of the Australian Writers Guild. So too is Matthew Diener, who is CEO of the Screen Producers Guild. Matthew?
G'day, how are you? And g'day, Claire.
Yeah, look, this is been seen broadly as a big win for the industry. How do you see it?
Look, it is because, I think the challenge with what was happening was that we absolutely needed this investment in the sector and investment in television. That goes into the whole ecosystem, and it means Australia's got this competitive ability to create bigger narratives, and that's important because that's what we're all watching, and it's also what the world wants of Australia. So all of that was important. The issue had been that the government had announced that the change would start at the 1st of July, and so everything was financed back from that. And if the legislation hadn't gone, listeners would know everything from Mystery Road, which is currently shooting, to After the Deluge on Foxtel and the 12, and all these sort of other things going on. After the Deluge actually is ABC. But the thing that was also happening was that there were changes into this that I think Claire was touching on, which were not being met by many people in the sector and many of our members as a positive, because they were trimming here and cutting there, and all of those things ultimately had cause for many people to be concerned. It was targeting smaller productions that were not going to receive support, and ultimately that meant small businesses across the country were effectively being additionally taxed or not supported in different ways, and we can get into all of that. But what happened was essentially the government stood Greens backing in behind it to change it, and look, it could have been a Mexican standoff if there's still a phrase, but thankfully, it did go through, and we've probably got some of the uncertainties at the moment in Parliament to thank for that, but ultimately it did its job, and we're very grateful because we all of that mess involved in trying to get through legislation, I think, it puts a lot of people now calmly ahead, and we've got a lot of things to still tackle, but at least this one's done and we can move on.
Mm-hmm. Well, Matthew Diener, I think you very diplomatically put it there that there was a lot of horse trading, and there was concessions made, and the winner luckily is the screen industry, which often isn't the case in those.
We are the beneficiary of that chaos, but we also, I have to say, we were a beneficiary of beneficiary of the minister for tackling this and putting more money on the table broadly. We're also the beneficiary of Tony Burke, who's masterful in the way he understands how the lower house works, and we're also a beneficiary of Sarah Hanson-Young, both masterful in dealing with the Senate. So there's a way in which all of those parties actually, either intentionally or not necessarily always intentionally, collaborated to make sure the sector was well supported, and ultimately we've got a good win out of it all.
So a major reform and big sigh of relief. And it comes at a time where the Australian film and television and screen industries, and also, which is important to acknowledge, it's always had it tough because we've got lots of creative people here, but we don't have the big audiences that you have in countries, elsewhere. Whereas if you put something on, there's just more people who'll go to it. So there's always been that tricky thing. And now that streaming is a thing, we're competing on the international stage, and so our productions have to be of high quality. They have to be as good. We can't just rely on it being an Australian story, and that's what the audience wants to see. It has to be huge. So, Matthew, does this help with that issue?
It absolutely does, and you've just nailed the problem, and also potentially what we're trying to do. Australians naturally and should expect really great entertainment and really great quality television and films and plays, the whole ecosystem. And it's not just that they expect it, but it's an important part of our, broader society. We've got to get that right because it's the way we enjoy ourselves and do things and understand without Australian stories, what's Australia, that kind of question. Um, what the opportunity is the export position for both us economically, but also to export Australia globally through what's now become a pipeline in and out, courtesy of Amazon and Netflix and Disney Plus and all of these services which many people are enjoying. In fact, most Australians have at least one of those services now. That creates the challenge of how do we make sure that that isn't our ground in that torrent of content? How do we make sure that we have stories that are robust enough financially to be well produced and get all of Claire's good members employed and engaged and working and across the crews that we have and across the actors and all of that? There's two layers to this. One of them is making sure the financing works, and I think that was what we saw today. And the second part is making sure there's a framework, some safeguards on those services for Australian stories. And that's the thing that I suppose is still sitting there as work to be done by this government and the parliament. They've started the process through a green paper discussion. And I think collectively, the Writers Guild, the Directors Guild, the Actors Union and crew and across the states, the whole industry is backing behind a 20% reinvestment in Australian stories by those big platforms. And that allows us to really make sure that there's money, not just from government, which is what we saw happening today, but also money from these very big platforms that are earning billions from Australia and are doing very well and should be contributing to our cultural narratives themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Matthew Dina from the Screen Producers Australia organisation is here. So is Claire Pullen from the Australian Writers Guild. Claire, Matthew's talking about competing on that international stage, and I know that the Writers Guild has done quite a bit in recent years to help people developed it into Shane Brennan, who himself is this huge figure in screenwriting. He's been a showrunner for NCIS in Los Angeles for many years. Has seen exactly what it takes to make one of those huge budget, big American series. Tell us what his role has been with the Writers Guild in getting people the support they need to get scripts up to scratch in Australia.
Oh, no question, Shane is absolutely a titan of our industry. I think he ran NCIS at the time. It was the most watched show in the world. And he is the sort of person that has the career that a lot of writers has been so invested, particularly in this regulation piece and making sure that he meets personally with the minister and gets to Canberra and advocates really strongly on behalf of the industry as a whole. He's profoundly aware of how lucky he is, which is not to say it's purely luck. He's superlatively gifted in his craft, but he's profoundly aware of the work that needs to be done to build an industry that gives writers a future in Australia and lets them be able to tell those amazing Australian stories. And he certainly invested in that personally a great deal, which our guild is very grateful for.
And you don't mean invested just in an airy-fairy sense. I mean, he's stumped up a lot of his...
Look, Shane and Catherine, I should be clear, have both been very generous with the Guild over the years in terms of investing in specific projects to create pathways for screenwriters to build up their skills, to work through them in a professional sense, to enter competitions and have their work improved, and then travel overseas and do the pitching work in the US industry to give them that sort of experience that he's had. He's invested in that in a really concrete way. and also does a huge amount of work for our guild. He's a volunteer chair, does that all in his spare time, and he genuinely believes in making sure Australians have jobs and opportunities and tell Australian stories on Australian screens. And
so that commitment, these are stories that we need to tell, we want to tell, and here's what we need to be able to do them. Matthew, Dina, one of the aspects of screen production that I guess anyone who's a casual observer should have sort of joined the dots, and I hadn't done it myself, but what we're watching with streaming is not just a movie. These are multi-episode productions, much bigger than they were before in terms of storytelling, but also in the costs that are involved. What does it cost to make like a, I don't know, 8-10 part streaming show now?
Look, over probably about $2 million per episode. You're right. What we're seeing now on screens is quality content that is needing to be, serious dollars needing to go into that to make it. And we're not just dealing with what was a 90-minute film that might cost anywhere in Australia between $5 to $10 million. You're dealing with multiple episodes, 10 hours of content in one sitting. So that's a very expensive exercise, and it's the reason that the challenge is raising capital in all of those exercises to be able to pull off the incredible ideas that Claire's members are creating and sort of fueling the industry with. So the challenge as a collective exercise is having system, having the people like Shane who can kind of provide a halo for the whole industry because they're well known and respected globally, and then be able to find the way to pull it off essentially and not have that all compromised because there's just not enough dollars to deliver. So the challenge is what you said, that because there's so much good content, and it isn't just 90 minutes or an hour or what was maybe, the sort of serial country practice style productions where you could sort of look, we all loved them, we grew up with them, but you could tell the wobbly sets a mile off, and these were small scale exercises. But now the expectation is that they are seriously big, expensive, pathways for people, and I think that's a good thing. The quality's really stepped up. I mean, I think there needs to be opportunities for people to train because it's a big jump to start on one of those things. It's a big drama for someone like Shane, and Claire would know better than I, but his career. But in order to get to that pinnacle, he had a lot of steps to get there, and we've still got to create the steps for our industry to go through where people get an opportunity, as they've often done on children's content and or smaller budget productions, smaller films. Those sort of things are the way that people get tested and can, test their muscle effectively and get noticed. And if we don't provide that moment, we don't get people to be able to go to the pinnacles of what we're seeing perhaps on our streaming services. So that's the whole ecology conversation as well. And things like the children's content that we are down on, in the sense of the amount of content that's been created since the commercial television quotas were changed at the start of the year, that's kind of creating a slow problem for us because we aren't going to, not only are audiences not seeing as much children's content on their services, but as an industry, it's not providing one of the pathways for people who were introduced into the sector, and often they can stay in the children's industry, but they also move into other parts of the industry from there. So, all of these things need to be thought of as a whole rather than individual parts if we're going to succeed.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the background to that is, that once children's television was a great winner for commercial television networks, but it's not so much anymore. In fact, it was an impost on them, they felt, and so the law created a certain amount, and that's changed, and with it, you say, lots of jobs. What about other opportunity? Oh, sorry, go ahead. Were you going to add to that?
Look, I was only going to say that I think that this is always, I don't think that it's always been an obstacle for commercial television to invest in children's content. There's always had to be requirements, or else it might not have been the natural thing that they'd put their money in as broadcasters. And the challenge for it is that you have to be very careful how you advertise to children on those services. It's very different on the internet, on YouTube, but for commercial broadcasters, they have a set of controls around that. So it's always been a challenge for them.
Yeah.
But as they've received, spectrum for free, pretty much, they've been able to deliver to audiences.
The bad for them. But
the maths have gotten harder.
Yeah. But you mentioned the online world, and I think also Claire touched on it a little bit before. This is a growth area, and Australia has great potential. What's happening? How is that affected by what we've just learned in the last day or two?
Well, I think that the revenues that we're able to receive from these new tax incentives are going to be able to be played out into streaming services, which have a more perhaps in this day and age, a more natural sort of ecosystem for different audiences who watch narrative content. Not always, and there's a payment that needs to be made, so it's not a universally accessible service unlike that will provide opportunities in those environments for content to be created. I think you still need a little bit of a safety net in those things, so that there's always going to make sure there's available and Australians can find their services on them. Because if you've gone to, I get terribly confused, and maybe I'm not the only person, but trying to find your way through some of the maps of the content is a very difficult thing. So one of the things you want to make sure you can find if you're Australian is, well, how do you find your Australian audience content, or for Australian audiences, on those services? So that's a big part of, I think, discoverability, which we need to get right. But then there's a broader question, I think, that you're alluding to, which is where are other audiences? Where are they on, YouTube or TikTok, or increasing on pieces of investment? But that's going to be a big, I think, growth area if we're going to have an opportunity to engage children, and we want to, because we want to make them feel they're part of Australia and their communities, and that their accents and their histories are well known to them. And I think that's an important part of growing up.
Right, Matthew. What you
Well,
say
I think
is
the
just
ABC does a
bonza.
glory job. Well, at the moment we have a very good service in the ABC doing a lot of the heavy lifting here, and I think that in my mind you shouldn't have to. Every service really should have a component of Australian content that you can access, and for all audiences.
Yeah, no doubt. And I wonder whether actually flagging it doesn't do it a great service. Sometimes I think that's the case. The industry, I mean, we've run out of time, but, if you're a young person listening to this, is it now the time to strike?
Absolutely. And look, one of the things that I've been struck by working in my role is the passion and commitment that my members bring to their work. And I'm not sure if you wanted to be a millionaire, anyone would ever recommend becoming a writer. But we're so lucky now with these changes to regulation and the work that we're going to do around the streamers. To pick up on Matt's point about the ecosystem, Disney Plus, one of the streamers that's relatively recently landed in Australia, have just bought Bluey.
Oh, that's right. I did hear that.
So we're now going to have more Australian stories, not just being told in Australia, but all around the world.
That's right. Yeah. Look, I mean, it's just, so often. Hey, look, thank you both for talking with me. Claire Pullen is the Executive Director of the Australian Writers Guild, and Matthew Diener from CEO of the Screen Producers Australia.